All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our event, the Russia-Ukraine War and Media. Our event today is hosted by SFU Public Square, partnering with the Digital Democracies Institute, SFU School of Communications, and SFU School for International Studies. And we would all like to thank you for joining us today. So my name is Nicole Jackson, and I have been asked to moderate today's discussion. I'm an associate professor at SFU School for International Studies, where I work on foreign policy and security issues in Russia and Eurasia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So first of all, before we begin, here are a few housekeeping notes. We have live transcription available, which you can access at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you do have any technical issues today, please send out a message to anyone with SFU Public Square in their Zoom name, and they will help you out. This event is being recorded and will be made available on SFU Public Square's website and YouTube channel and shared with you shortly. Finally, we'd all like to remind you of our community guidelines, which will also be posted in the chat box. Above all, there will be zero tolerance for those who promote violence or discrimination against others on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, or disability. And obviously, anybody who incites harm towards other participants will be removed at the discretion of the event hosts. So welcome again. The format for today's event will be as follows. Each of the four panelists will give a short 5 to 6 minute presentation on their topic of expertise as related to the war in Ukraine and media. We will then have an open conversation between the speakers on what we heard. For the final 20 minutes or so, we'll have a question and answer period where we'll take some of your questions submitted through Zoom's questions and answer function, which you can find right now at the bottom of your screen. So do feel free to submit your questions at any point during this event. I'd also like you to be aware that 3 of our speakers are in Europe and 1 in Ukraine, where she may experience internet connectivity issues, air raid sirens, and difficulties with electricity. So you'll see that the lighting on her will be a little bit darker than maybe normal. So first, I've been asked by the organizers to provide you with some context. And I can tell you that we have a multidisciplinary group of 4 international experts from Ukraine and Europe and Canada, who will address issues surrounding questions of how the media has played a role in shaping public opinion and narratives about the Russia-Ukraine war. They're all broadly interested in questions such as how do ideas circulate in society, whose ideas are privileged, whose get left out, who benefits from certain narratives about the war, how is information disseminated, interpreted, and used, and how does this influence the way we understand the world and each other? So within this context, we hope to have a discussion about how the media, Russian state media, other media, Ukrainian media, European media, Canadian media, whether traditional media or so-called new media, social media, images and art, how all of these shape our perceptions about the war, the experiences of people living through the war, the role of a variety of different actors, and also how we think about the end of the war and how peace may be achieved. So I think it goes without saying that this discussion is important and timely, okay, for many, many reasons. But these include, number one, this past Monday marked the 8 months since Russia began its large-scale invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, which followed annexation occupation of Crimea in 2014. And this has been extremely brutal war, devastating for Ukraine and Ukrainians. and its kaleidoscope of effects continue to reverberate around the world. Second, I'm here at Simon Fraser University in Canada, and Canadians, alongside dozens of other countries and around the world, are responding in, I think, a whole variety of ways. And in Canada, for example, we are sending military equipment and training, humanitarian help, economic and political support, and also engaging, right? We're also engaging through our media. Third, actors in this war, as in other wars, are using a variety of means and platforms to create narratives for their cause, sometimes trying to neutralize efforts of their enemies. And although manipulation of public opinion and media censorship have been part of warfare throughout history, I think in some ways, and I hope to hear about this more from the panelists, this war has seen an extraordinary level of media engagement and narratives spinning, and a large spectrum of information and disinformation targeting different audiences locally and around the world. So we see a complex media ecosystem, which includes not only traditional journalists, but individuals, think tanks, state actors, such as diplomats, military communication experts, scholars, and so on and so forth, all involved in using and misusing traditional means and new opportunities afforded by high tech. So just for example, some of these actors are trying to shape what is actually happening and understood to be happening on the actual battlefield. Others are trying to help civilians by sharing brutal realities and facts on the ground, while others are trying to hide or deny those same facts or to disseminate lies. Some hope to inform or alternatively to confuse perceptions of different local and global audiences. Some are adding deliberately and inadvertently to the chaos and uncertainty. Others are trying to manipulate emotions and terrorize, to influence Western and global support, or to silence voices. And some of these narratives, words, and images, we can argue how much effect they have, but many times they have quite a dramatic and devastating effects, shaping the war, different understandings about it, people's lives, and also, I think, the possibilities for peace. So this topic could not be more important, complex, or timely. The war shows no sign of ending soon, and there is plenty for us to discuss. I look forward to learning more from our speakers. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our first speaker today, who is Andreas Umland. Andreas is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for East European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and he is also an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kiev. So welcome, Andreas.
Thanks for introducing me. Should I start already?
Yes.
So the topic of the seminar or panel is very broad, and one could talk about many various aspects of the media presentation of the war. And I reflect here a little bit on the continental West European, and particularly German, media presentation of the war and the problems that are still there. In general, one could perhaps already say that the war of narratives, as we had it before 2014, before the start of the war, or before February 2022, before the escalation of the war, the war of the narratives, at least in Germany, has to a certain degree ended. Before that, we had presentations of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There was a lot of talk about, for instance, Ukrainian nationalism, the Ukrainian far right, which in fact is a minor political force in Ukraine, and some sort of justification for, let's say, the annexation of Crimea because of historical reasons or legal reasons or demographic reasons. And these narratives have now, in my perception at least, And I wonder how Vasil or Svetlana are thinking about it. They have largely the Russian counter-narratives, the justifications, apologies for attacking Ukraine. They have largely lost their weight in at least in the German discussion, as I know best. The main problem that I now see in Germany, and I wonder how it is in Canada or in other countries, is that what you usually observe in the public debates about the war and the German behavior towards the war, and in general the Western behavior, NATO's behavior, Western Europe's behavior about the war, is a balancing or juxtaposition of empathy on the one side and security on the other side. So on the one hand, we have a rather now broad position, unified, I would say, position, I would say, throughout the European Union, which is characterized by a lot of empathy for Ukrainians in this their war for independence, for liberation, for survival, in fact. That is now what many people actually acknowledge in, let's say, Germany, which I know best. What then appears, and that is then expressed in public discussions, that of course support the Ukrainian war for freedom, for survival, and for the country, for the nation, and against this aggression. And then the second argument that then usually comes in and then creates a sort of debate is the issue of the national interests of the West European countries, like, for instance, Germany. Here then often the argument becomes very quickly turned to security issues, basic national security issues of, let's say, Germans, and why German support for Ukraine should be limited. Because while we have a lot of empathy for the Ukrainians and we want to support them and we have a lot of solidarity for the Ukrainians, we have also our own security interests, which is primarily that we don't want to be drawn into this war, we don't want to trigger World War III, we don't want to be attacked by Russia, we are not ready to basically invest here too much into this war because it's going to be expensive for us, not only perhaps in military terms or in terms of a possible World War III, but also in terms of energy and so on. So we should be restrained in our help because of our national interest. And then you have the sort of balancing of emotion versus rationality. And unfortunately, that is what is often happening. And what is not appearing in these discussions are the national interests of, let's say, the Germans in the Ukrainian victory in this war and in the full withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine, from mainland Ukraine, and from Crimea. Why this would be important for Germans, not only for Ukrainians, and why our help for Ukrainians should not be just out of empathy and solidarity, but out of our own national interests. And what I'm referring here is the undermining of Russia, not only of the Ukrainian state, but also of the European security order, and even, let's say, of the worldwide international security system, of international organizations, of international law, of the rules-based order, of basic principles of international law as defined in the UN Charter, in the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the various documents adopted by this organization, and in many other international treaties and organizations. And that if Russia has success in this war, or at least partial success, and if the Western help for Ukraine is only partial, that this sends then not only a very sad signal to the Ukrainians, but in fact to the entire world, to all countries of the world, to all nations of the world, namely that you cannot rely on the international order, you cannot rely on the European Security Order, you cannot rely on international organizations, international law, and the solidarity of the full solidarity of nations when they try to defend their political sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the most, I think, dangerous aspect here of Russian behavior is Russia's mining of the so-called nuclear non-proliferation regime. Is defined in a treaty signed in 1968 when Russia still not and Ukraine still not existed as independent state, but which was then created the treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, created by the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, which allowed 5 countries in the world to have nuclear weapons, namely the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia, and which forbids all other signatories of this treaty, and almost all countries of the world have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty to have nuclear weapons. And what we have here, and this is, I think, the biggest scandal of this entire war, is that a country that is officially allowed to have nuclear weapons, Russia, is using its nuclear weapons to exert pressure on Ukraine, on the international system, on the West, with the weapons that it is officially allowed to have by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Whereas on the other hand, Ukraine is attacked by Russia and cannot defend itself against Russia and cannot deter Russia, because not only it does not have nuclear weapons, but because it is forbidden by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to have nuclear weapons. And the even odder thing here about Ukraine, some of you may know that, is that Ukraine once had nuclear weapons in the early 1990s. Actually a lot of nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union, and then agreed to give it away. It gave it the weapons to Russia, and is now a so-called non-nuclear weapons state. And of course, Russia's behavior now puts the logic of the non-proliferation regime on its head, because it basically gives Russia a big advantage in this war. And what if Ukraine does not get enough help from such countries as Germany or like Canada, then other countries around the world will conclude that they cannot rely on the international order in general and the non-proliferation regime in particular, and they will simply think about acquiring new weapons of mass destruction, because they don't want to end up as bad a situation as Ukraine, and maybe they even want to end up in as good as a situation as Russia, because they may have interest to annex territories from neighboring states themselves, and they may decide that they need nuclear weapons for that. So what I'm heading here is that we are, of course, we Germans, for instance, and I guess most people in the world, are interested to prevent nuclear proliferation, the spread of atomic weapons. And that is only one of the reasons why we should have a very core and very large national interest, full Ukrainian victory in this war, because only a Ukrainian victory, full victory in this war, will signal that the international system works, that countries that are not protected by nuclear weapons will get help from other countries, whether they have nuclear weapons or don't have nuclear weapons, and that their political sovereignty, their territorial integrity is secured by international law and by international organizations. And so what we need in Germany, and I guess in many other countries too, is to get a little bit away from the empathy and solidarity discourse and to enter more the issue about national interests of Western countries, in fact, all countries of the world, in a Ukrainian victory, in order to secure the international security system, in order to secure the non-proliferation regime, and to prevent the world from becoming entirely anarchic where basically everybody is for her or himself and tries to get as many weapons of mass destruction just to be secure or to extend one's territory. So I guess I went for too long here. I'm sorry about that, and I finished.
No, thank you so much, Andreas, for your extremely thoughtful comments and look at Western, and particularly maybe German, but I think Western media and portrayals of the Ukraine war and the dangers of some of the kind of dichotomy in terms of the narratives. I'd next like to bring in Vasil Cherepanin. Vasil is the head of the Visual Cultural Center, Research Center, an institution that he co-founded in Kyiv in 2008 as a platform for collaboration among academic, artistic, and activist communities. I understand, Vasil, that you are now in Berlin, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you hear me well, right? Yeah, first of all, I would like to express my deep thankfulness for having me here. First of all, to Svetlana Matviyenko for this very kind invitation, but also to the university itself, Simon Fraser University. So I think that I just really appreciate this opportunity, and for that matter, I would also like to thank to the Ukrainian military, without which I wouldn't be able simply to sit here. And actually, without the Ukrainian military resistance, my country wouldn't exist, at least at the form it currently does. But I think it's not only about Ukraine, to be honest, but it's very much about the European Union as such, because it would also not exist if not the Ukrainian military resistance. So in this sense, I would also kind of a short introductory note. I would like also to comment the title of the today's event, right, which is very much referring to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And with regards to the media, by the way, it's especially in the Western media, this war is being simply pretty often referred as Ukraine's war or war in Ukraine, right? Even without mentioning Russia at all, which I find very, very much problematic, to put it softly. But at the same time, I don't think, to be honest, that this is only a Russian-Ukrainian war. I think this is what we are dealing with, especially at the current stage. It's more than obvious that it is the great European war, which looks very much like a world war. So perhaps it is a world war, but that's, I just don't want to distract our attention towards that direction, because it will bring us in a bit different realm. But with regards to the media, I also have to acknowledge that my interest and my optics within this proposed framework is basically very much defined by a kind of a survival mode that my country, myself included, unavoidably, inevitably share, right, for obvious reasons. So in this sense, when I look at the media discourse visually, discursively, I'm rather trying to understand and analyze the instruments that have been out there for being used to stop this unthinkable atrocity as soon as possible, but for that or another reason have not been used for that matter, unfortunately, right? So in this sense, so I basically believe that this kind of, that Andreas, thank you so much for your kind presentation, that Andreas already referred to a bit, that this really unprecedented so-called collective Western response towards Russia in economic, political, geopolitical, and infrastructural, and so on terms. It's really unprecedented solidarity in very practical, even pragmatic sense, right? But I think this became the case very much because of the pressure from the societal side, from the side of societies and publics in the EU countries, in the Western countries, but in general, globally, right? So without that societal pressure, in my view, their respective governments wouldn't embark on this kind of really hardcore endeavor and unprecedented indeed pressure. So for that matter, media and journalists, right, also on a very personal level, knowing some of them, I think they contributed immensely, and without them, this kind of pressure or war pressure, let's put it in these honest terms, right, wouldn't be possible at all. So, and I think that this became the case not only because the media, like we usually know, especially in the West, this is the fourth power and so on, right? That it occupies a certain part, sociologically speaking, of society. But I think it's just because what was also perhaps for the first time in the human history that media, and I'm speaking here with regards to the period before the 24th of February, that media had been used as a means of deterrence, right? It was a deliberate decision, as we know, from the US government side, that they actually at certain point understood that media channels could work against the enemy, right? So for in this sense, it was exactly because of this, right? Because of this deliberate decision that all the Western media had been constantly on the permanent, everyday really basis reporting on the Kremlin's plans, on the what is going to happen, and so on, right? So and I think that because of these deterrents, especially the Western media have earned and owned a lot of power that they had never used before. And I think that very much, unfortunately, really, in my view, that this power hasn't been used after the full-scale invasion started to make this war stop as soon as possible, right? So what I mean here is basically that so for this, in this sense, this war is really unique from the media perspective, because this is indeed the most documented war in the human history, even before the start of this full-scale invasion, I would say, right? So I think this kind of dialect is really very much important in understanding how media work in this within this war framework, right? So what I mean here that media, instead of pushing not just because of Ukraine, right? Not because of it's just because of Ukrainian cause, but because of this injustice, unbelievable injustice, and genocidal fantasies and practices and so on. They owned so huge outrage and anger, but they appear to be really a bit afraid to use those heavily loaded political, actually, fundamental emotions which define unavoidably all of our life, like it or not, right? To the full extent. Instead, they chose to adjust their authorities and their publics to what has been going on. So, and instead of having, in a way, never again, right now, we got kind of an foot dragging and sort of this kind of process of waiting for another, even bigger than has already happened, catastrophe. I'm sure that it is going to come, but unfortunately, we have to pay a very high price, right, for that. And another point that I'm going was going to make in this regard is that basically, pretty often, at least I'm judging in this case from my personal as well as institutional encounters throughout the last 7 or 8 months, right? That actually, pretty often the Western media have been following the logic of victimology, victimization, within which Ukrainians have been assigned the role of victims that they cannot really analyze, that they can only cry out something. So it was a kind of a double trap framework in which it is only the Western experts that provide sort of big picture analysis, whereas the locals are only confined to sort of first-hand observations or personal stories from your life. So, and I think this was also a big mistake with regards to the visual and discursive politics of the Western media. And just to, the last point I wanted to make that actually what I also find very much problematic, and this has been felt also, especially from the Western media side, that that it has been functioning, this media field has been functioning as a kind of a the same way, like sort of treating Ukrainians as victims only, but at the same time function as a kind of a protective emotional shield, I would say, protecting the Western audiences from strong affective truth, like limiting strong emotions like fury, pain, anger, rage, right? As if, and treating like those who had been expressing them as if like full expression of these or extreme expression of these emotions would deprive the subject of a possibility to judge rationally, as if we have only judged on some imagined neutral basis, which I totally don't believe in, right? Especially under the current conditions. So I think that this kind of sort of antagonisms within the media Western field, sort of we could be at the moment much further in terms of stopping this war if at least some of the moments that I just shortly mentioned would work out. Yeah, thank you so much. I look much forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Vasil. I mean, you've given your perspective, which is so important, and you've highlighted, I think it's great that you've highlighted the importance of society, media within society, and the media's, use of deterrence, but also kind of where is the potential for peace here? How can they move us further towards peace? What is the role of emotions and so on? So thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Kayla Hillstop. Kayla is a PhD candidate at SFU School of Communications and a researcher on the cyber war topologies research stream at the Digital Democracies Institute. So thank you. Welcome, Kayla.
Thanks, Nicole, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers and partners in hosting this event. I'm here to share some perspectives from a project that I'm working on at the Digital Democracies Institute with colleagues Dalton Kamish, Matthew Canute, and Svetlana Matvienko, who's here today. We're working on exploring some of the dynamics of the Canadian coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war as it relates to the oil and gas industry and its impact on public opinion. And we're still in the early stages of the project, but we wanted to share some hypotheses, some preliminary findings, and some observations that we're making for conversation today. So we came to the project with the understanding that the oil and gas sector is fueling Russia's war budget. And so the international community has been putting pressure on Russia through sanctioning its oil and gas. For example, Canada and the G7 have been taking measures. They took some in September, and then secondary round in October. So these crucial measures that are happening to sanction oil and gas in Russia raises the question, who will supply Europe's fossil fuels? And so at the moment, Germany is looking to secure some deals with Canada. And so the question is, what does this have to do with media? Well, in the media, this question's come up quite a bit, actually, starting back in 2010, when Ezra Levant wrote his book called Ethical Oil, The Case for Canada's Oil Sands. And his argument is that because Canada is a liberal democracy, we should not be buying oil from authoritarian governments like Saudi Arabia or Russia. And instead, we should be providing more oil to the world from Canada so that other states don't need to buy oil from these countries either. And so this book was reported on quite widely and very favorably in national news, TV news, newspapers. A chain called Sun newspapers published extended excerpts of the book, became a bestseller. And in a short time, Levant's coined phrase ethical oil became some official government talking points of the Harper conservatives, and then now Pierre Poilievre's conservatives. And Levant's a very important figure in right-wing politics in Canada. I think at the time when he wrote the book, he could have been characterized as a conservative political activist, but now he's grown into this far-right celebrity, and he went on to co-found Rebel Media, which is a right-wing news outlet and known for disinformation as well. And so the book is written in this far-right, cynical, polemical style. And his argument in there's much to critique. I'd say probably most importantly from the start that it does not correspond with the economic realities of the global oil and gas trade for several reasons, but I'll just dwell on one for a moment. That physical location of fossil fuels does not demonstrate ownership or control of the resource in any real way in this very complex, globally integrated oil trade. So the fossil fuel deposits here and the accompanying infrastructure, yes, it might be physically located in Canada, but the majority of its profits actually go to foreign-owned companies, mostly American, Chinese companies, Saudi companies, others. And then, of course, there are ethical questions surrounding oil that is extracted in Canada too. I think we're probably at a point now where we can safely say that there's no such thing as ethical oil, and that production to meet immediate needs must consider consent from Indigenous nations and also be accompanied by a plan for a just transition off of fossil fuels. But regardless of all this, the ethical oil argument still has quite a grip on the Canadian imagination, and when opportunities arise, it can be deployed, like right now in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. In our study, we found that between late February and April, there were at least 42 news articles that ran in Canada mentioning this ethical oil argument, as opposed to the one that we found in the same time period last year. So that's quite a change. We're also doing some analysis on Twitter discourse to learn about how people in Canada are engaging with these ideas that are being presented by the media. But while we're doing that, we're also drawing on some Ipsos polls that I think are quite interesting to better understand how public opinion is changing. Since the war started, we found a poll that indicated 72% of Canadians want to export energy to Europe. 45% said supporting Canada's allies in Europe is more important than fighting climate change right now. 46% said Canada's inability to supply Europe with natural gas has helped Putin hold Europe hostage in meeting its energy needs. So I think these are all quite significant things to discuss, particularly that nearly half of Canadians saying that not expanding fossil fuel extraction is aiding Putin's war. So this is kind of a dangerous line of thinking that has implications for environmental activists and Indigenous resistance to oil and gas. There's also quite a change in public opinion that we're observing that, just 3 months before the start of the war, almost 2/3 of Canadians said that they supported immediately capping greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands, and that's even if it does put jobs at risk. So again, quite a change. So there's a lot to explore within this project, but what we want some of this research to do is to provide insights into how Canadian nationalism is imagined, reimagined, and acted upon in opportune moments. And I think it can also tell us something about global political economy and how both rivalries and dependencies are exposed and reshaped during times of crises. And I think we must really think about and be critical of what incentives and opportunities this war has created for oil and gas in Canada. And I'll just close by saying that fossil fuel capital interest in this country have really not let this crisis go to waste. And so for those of us who are in the 91% of Canadians who oppose Putin's war, we must really consider how our desire to create policy that could support a just peace in Ukraine can be exploited. Most importantly, how a lot of this liquefied natural gas infrastructure that's proposed to be built to support Europe will take years to build. So it's not exactly an immediate solution to ending the war. So I think I'll stop there for now, and I look forward to our conversation afterwards, and I'll pass it back to you, Nicole.
Hey, thank you very much, Kayla, for coming here and talking about your research and progress. I know we'll all be very interested to follow up and hear more about the results as you have them. Okay, so thank you. Let's move on to Svetlana Matvienko. Hey, I'd like to welcome you, Svetlana, once again. You're here to talk with us. Svetlana is an assistant professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communications. We're very grateful that Svetlana could join us today from Ukraine, where she has been teaching remotely from the start of this conflict. And as I mentioned, of course, you may expect some disruptions in our conversation on her side because of many challenges right now that are happening in Ukraine. So thank you, Svetlana, for making the time and trying to join us today.
Thank you, Nicole, and I thank very much to all organizing team and to wonderful co-presenters here. And I am going to share my slides with you, in which I will, first of all, introduce some kind of broader perspective on how I see certain forces are engaged, world forces are engaged in this war. And then I will shift to certain kind of smaller examples of how certain practices, media practices and media reporting unfold. So, okay. And what I'm about to suggest is this. So there were many debates about what is the driving force of this war, how to understand it, whether it has to do with some kind of global confrontation of global powers, or whether it's just about Ukraine and Russia. And you would hear very different arguments about this. And I want to suggest that this war is indeed many things at the same time. So it is really overdetermined. But it remains this capitalist fossil fuel war. But we need to distinguish for a better understanding and maybe for kind of finding solutions, for finding the ways to fight it, and to hopefully bring it to the end closer and closer. We need to understand its multi-vectoral kind of structure, architecture. And there are at least two vectors that I can sort of see here. One is inter-imperial. And this is very much related to what Kayla was explaining in her presentation, what Andres addressed in his presentation about the nuclear threats and how they use, and what Vasil was also talking about. So here, the technique that is engaged on this vector is probably could be identified as deterrence. And deterrence here could be understood in the way how Vasil spoke about it, but mostly I'm actually bringing up this old term that was used in, that is remembered from the Cold War times. So that deterrence, which is a form of a complex and aggressive negotiation with the help of nuclear weapons. And in this vector operates or kind of like kind of shapes the relation between Russia and other world powers. What's specific about this vector and what I see there is that it's not really about kind of breaking entirely certain relational structure, political economic structure that is set already, but rather kind of shaking it a little bit. So it's about redistribution of power, but with preserving certain capitalist regimes, which have, of course, all the colonial and imperial legacies. So, and that's where precisely deterrence is not about breaking, right? So deterrence is about pushing towards this kind of moment when the opposing side scares off and accepts certain conditions, right? So, and that's what is deterrence. Focused on preserving. And then there is another very important vector actually here, which is the imperial war. The imperial war that is going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with potential expansion towards post-Soviet countries or even some European countries. And that has to do with the restoration of imperial powers. In a certain way, this vector also shows, I think, a certain crisis of fossil fuel capitalism and certain kind of hysterical breakdown, basically, right? So, and the fact that there is no logic there, right, in this particular invasion. There is no logic there, and that's why many people did not believe that this invasion would happen, precisely because it's illogical, because the harm that the Russian Federation also causes to itself in this process is just so huge that those people who saw that that would be so destructive for that country itself wouldn't believe that the country would actually go into this war by destructing itself in the process, which pretty clearly will happen. The question is sooner or a little later. So with this desire of restoring the power, feeling the crisis, the only strategy that the country saw is the imperial strategy, is like moving towards one of the parts of this empire, Soviet empire and Russian empire, right? And Soviet country as basically the inheritance of the Russian empire. And when we think about this last dimension, and now within this broader framework, I also want to speak about media. And I will focus specifically on terror and certain ways how terror is produced, certain effects of terror are produced on the ground, but also with the help of media, very different kinds of media, as Nicole mentioned, from social media to bigger newspapers, outlets, and etc. And before we do so, I just also only want to bring up with this one quote from a historian, Charles Townshend, who studies terror. And that's what he says about it. Clearly, war and terror are intimately related. It is hard to imagine a war that didn't generate extreme fear among many people. And sometimes this is more than a byproduct of violence. It is a primarily objective. The essence of terrorism, by contrast, is surely the negation of combat. And I think it's quite interesting and important to consider in this particular context, because of course, on the 243 5th day of a promised 3-day blitzkrieg, we definitely see a problem with combat. So therefore, the combat of the Russian army, right? So not necessarily its negation, but a crisis, a particular crisis problem of combat. So terror becomes really a weapon, really a means in this war. And over this 6 and more than 6 months, I've been documenting many different dimensions that engaged or used for production of terror. And one of them, and here also I want to comment that very often I'm asked to explain how disinformation and propaganda works, for example, but specifically disinformation in the context of this war. And I always say that I'm less even interested now in the matter of disinformation per se. I'm more interested how disinformation became so bizarre and so convoluted that, in fact, we kind of see more production of terror than production of disinformation. And by means of absolutely absurdity, absolutely absurd lies that we wouldn't even be interested in the fact that they are lies, but what they point to or how they are constructed, what kind of affects are engaged in there. So, for example, one context where we can observe this is the context of genocidal violence and genocidal murder. So here we would say that the genocidal murder itself, which became a discovery from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, basically 1 month after the Russian forces withdraw from the smaller cities and villages closer and in Kiev region. So that's where we already discovered some unbelievable sites of genocide. Just the knowledge of that is already terror, right? So the terror begins with this genocidal practice itself. The way how it was kind of orchestrated or spontaneously sort of kind of enticed was kind of different. One of those things that still needs kind of research and thinking is, of course, sort of weaponization of poverty, weaponization of race, and all different problematic things that, of course, we saw in many wars, and this war is not an exception. So the terror, the production of terror begins with the practice of basically extermination and violent, extreme violence towards the Ukrainian population, civilian population, by the way, on the fact that they are Ukrainians. Then this fact is turned or becomes a media event. And when it becomes a media event, we saw quite paradoxical kind of unfolding of this event, which has to do with the Russian side denial of that it happened. This denial is another act of terror, I would say, because you could only imagine how extremely hurtful it is after learning about what happened on those territories to hear that it was staged, to hear that it was some kind of Hollywoodish production. This denial and the way how it was, this genocide was denied, is also an act of terror. act of humiliation. It's an act of a kind of subjectal erasure, basically, right? So it's a denial of this fact. So, and I find it also important and kind of decidedly, it's not only because someone in the Russian government, etc., wanted to kind of not admit to the fact that it was happening, but I actually think it was also strategic. And then you would hear, of course, with more proofs and investigations and many witnesses left who could tell the stories of what was actually happening there. We also see how, in what bizarrish way, this narrative or these narratives unfold, to the extent that we saw just recently within a couple of last days, when one of the anchors of Russia Today announces on the major state channel of Russian TV that Ukrainian children should be drowned or burned. And I wouldn't have even mentioned that, right? But I actually want to point here how with this complete absurdity, right? So is how this narrative runs towards complete absurdity, where it also kind of used to trigger, again, all these feelings, humiliate people, and and all that. And I will just mention probably just a couple of two things, so I probably will ask 1 or 2 minutes if I may. So another dimension, which is, of course, has to do with nuclear terrorism, right? And also the narrative that was unfolding through this entire time, from the moment of the occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear power station, as we know, to another occupation of the Zaporizhia nuclear power station. And the way how when Zaporizhia nuclear power station, so Chernobyl nuclear power station triggered all sort of symbolic moments, right? So which was very easy to produce certain effects of terror and kind of mobilize traumas, fears, old memories, etc. But Zaporizhia was kind of new here, and the moment when Zaporizhia was occupied, Zaporizhia nuclear power station was occupied, it was even possible to watch it on TV live. So, and that's where I was kind of very interested in what this particular possibility, which was kind of embedded, right? So embedded in media platforms themselves. So this, the regime of immediacy, which itself kind of added to production of terror. And this obviously discourse of the nuclear deterrence and speculation and blackmail and etc. unfolds in so many ways until, again, very recently, we hear kind of news story about sort of Ukrainians allegedly making some dirty bomb. And it's interesting how with Russian media, it unfolds as always, how when they say we will not do this, and then they do exactly the opposite. So that's how the narratives like this about dirty bomb, known as a false flag operations, right? So if Ukrainians are accused of potentially creating and exploding some kind of dirty bomb, then maybe something like this is a potential threat, whether it's only for creating of terror, or it actually will end up in actual practice and actual exposure, we even do not know. So anyway, with all this kind of things like about the dirty bomb, about denial of genocide, about announcements, as in this particular famous already article by Timofey Sergeytsev that was published in spring in RIA Novosti official kind of and state approved channel. So these are all many different ways in which terror is produced. So it's not just lies, it's not just information, it's a kind of really massage with feelings and affects that targeting Ukrainian population in a very kind of serious way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Svetlana. Okay, you gave a very cogent and kind of powerful presentation looking at different dimensions of Russian state and media terror. And we can all think about whether, you know, we should be talking so much about disinformation or about terror, or how they work together, okay, in combination, what is different, what is similar. All right, it is now 1:30. And we can have a little bit of time for discussion amongst the panelists before the question and answers. I've taken a look and we've had, you know, up to about 200 participants here. So I would just like to remind those participants that you can submit your questions through Zoom. If you have a question for a particular presenter, please highlight it. So include their name in your question. Obviously, due to time, we won't necessarily be able to answer all of your questions, but we'll see and we'll get to as many as we can. Okay, so now's a chance where the panelists can all respond to each other and what they've said. We want this to be a little bit more free-flowing, but not so structured. But I can say that, I mean, all of you are interested in evolution of narratives, okay, and sometimes a dichotomy of narratives and ideas and so on in this war. And we often, you know, hear this question, I think kind of, at least in the Western media, of who is winning the media war, which actors, which ones are and which ones not. I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit more about that from your perspective or from the perspective of the countries, right, in which you're doing research, in which you're thinking about, and to whom or what do you credit those wins? I mean, I'm also interested in kind of whose narratives do you think are being left out or we are not hearing from here in the West or in Ukraine. So I'm not sure who would like to begin. Svetlana, would you like to begin, or Andreas? Okay.
Andreas, would you like to?
Oh, I'm seeing already questions in the Q&A here, which I can respond to, maybe because I don't have. Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm having a little problem hearing you. Does someone want to answer this question before we move on to the question and answers?
Which question? I didn't get that quite.
Okay, I'm just trying to get you to think about, you know, when we hear this question in the Western media, everyone's talking about who's winning the narrative war. Is Zelensky winning the narrative war? What does that mean to you? Which actors do you think are being successful? How do we understand success, right? To whom? And so on, right? Who do you credit? Why do we credit sub-narratives of coming up to the fore in different, right, audiences, and other ones, obviously, we are not hearing from? Okay, I'm trying to think of some questions that you can all answer from different perspectives of whether this means you've talked about media in Germany, but we could talk about media in Canada, right, in Ukraine, and so on.
I think that what we have now is a situation very different from a year ago, in that, as I said, this sort of the narratives have been somewhat devalued because the simple facts on the ground are maybe even more important. The pictures, the authentic pictures from the ground, they are so overwhelming that the narratives have sort of, no narrative with which you can justify what Russia is doing. You can even if you still believe this sort of fascism story or something like that, or that there was a coup in Ukraine, or these different, or Crimea was taken from Russia away in 1954. I mean, we had a lot of discussion until February last year about these different interpretations of certain historical, political, cultural issues in Ukraine, and usually about Ukraine and not so much about Russia. But now just the behavior of Russia is so, in a way, Zelensky has played a role in all of that, of course, but sometimes I'm asked by Western people, what would happen if Zelensky if they had catched Zelensky, or if Zelensky dies, will then, I'm saying, actually it wouldn't much happen. We would have another leader in Ukraine. I don't know what the others think about, and maybe not quite as media savvy as Zelensky is, because he's coming out of show business, so he knows how to perform on media, on media. But with another president, male, female, I don't think that much would have actually changed. So in a way, I'm more now worried about sort of judgments about the nature of the conflict, and these sort of the worldviews and this sort of the more general issues like pacifism. And in Germany, we have this peculiar problem, maybe there's also a problem in Canada, that there are certain countries and nations that live in geopolitically very comfortable situations. So we are in Germany surrounded by friendly nations, who are our friends and partners and so on. So, and that then creates all sort of problems, because we don't understand wars, and we don't know what insecurity really is, and we believe in this bubble in that we are living. And well, and so I think that, but that's more general about, it's not any longer that much about Russia. I think most people in Germany, they now think that really the current Russian leadership is evil, simply. And so, but the problem is, how do we deal with this evil?
Yes, thank you, Andreas. And to that, I also want to add that I completely agree with on Zelensky part. And I actually think, let me just for 1 second share one slide with you, which actually speaks to that. That was one of my sort of a kind of disappointment in Western narratives. It's a sort of fetishization of the leader, which definitely falls into the entire hero kind of narrative, which is quite upsetting to me, even though I do recognize how well Zelensky works with media and etc. But we also had the precedent when, for example, during many mobilizations and protests, there was already recognition of the protester, the anonymous protester, the people who could be acknowledged as an active power in a certain event, right? So what is happening in Ukraine at this moment is precisely that, right? So we have the people who are the most powerful kind of force there, right? So the level of mobilization, the level of support, the level of activism that each of us engaged in so many levels. Each of us support something financially. Each of us collect certain goods and do some simple jobs. Each of us host people, refugees, etc. at home, and we also speak like 24/7 to the media. So I can't imagine how many jobs I could literally list that we all do. So, and everyone does this. So, and that is absolutely amazing. And of course, what Vasil mentioned, our military, who are literally on the front line, but this whole activism of people, that what really kind of, shapes this resistance. That's why we are here. And Times still post just kind of Zelensky image, though. No, we are the Ukrainian people. The only time when I saw this recognition was very recently with this Sakharov award, when it was awarded to the Ukrainian people and Zelensky, and I thought like, oh, okay, so a little shift there, a little kind of, move towards acknowledging what is actually happening here. But that is one of, problems with the narratives and how it's perceived, right? So during the first couple of months, I was constantly kind of getting requests, including from New York Times and etc. Everyone wanted to know how well Zelensky is with videos. And when I received that request in March from New York Times, I thought like, really? How well Zelensky is with videos? So, and that was really kind of, weird and kind of disgusting in a certain way. So anyway.
Yeah, I can see, Vasil, you have your hand up. Vasil, we can't hear you.
Right. I hope now it works. Yeah. Just to pick up where my colleagues just left, I think basically that that actually these kind of really unprecedented societal sort of energy and ability with regards to self-organization and to withstand and to oppose this unprecedented aggression is very much based on the kind of a revolutionary habit that Ukraine has gained, right, already 8 years ago, but basically throughout the 21st century, I would say. So without this kind of a revolutionary background, you wouldn't be able to resist from the very start of this full-scale invasion. So I think that's what perhaps also I would refer to what Svetlana was saying, that I think that this is really a unique possibility, because now, I mean, we are somehow trapped within the optics of war, which is, of course, I mean, natural in a way, but at the same time, we pretty often forget how Ukraine had been shaped by totally the opposite, politically speaking, right? By quite the opposite, by the revolution. So it was exactly the opposite of the warfare that has brought our country to the current level, and this unprecedented indeed dimension of self-cooperation and engagement. So this habit sort of turned out to be really vital for survival. But at the same time, I also think that what you, Nicole, was asking, what you were asking about, like with regards to the narrative and what has been left out and which narrative has been winning. I think it's already kind of it's also, I think, because of that we have to deal with narratives when we have lost time in some sense, right? And I think that it's actually so in my view, and I think, I mean, I believe my colleagues would agree with me that in certain sense, the EU wasn't able to pass the Ukrainian test, and that's why it's so easy now to talk about narratives, right? Just because in realpolitik, in terms of deeds and in terms of actions, they just failed, right? I mean, in terms of the revolution, in terms of in 2014, and even on the 24th of February this year. And basically, I think I do appreciate very much what Svetlana outlined, because I actually also have, to be honest, pretty kind of, it's not just pessimistic, right? But I really share this kind of a pretty dark vision for the years to come, unfortunately, just because I think that we are in a situation where the so-called domino effect has already started. We, even inside Ukraine, are not completely aware of this, even at the moment. and I think that the most dangerous thing that did take place, especially with regards to the European continent, right? And of course, I'm here referring to the complicated history of Europe and so on. But that I find it really super problematic that media-wise, but also politics-wise, right? That all of the European countries, even before the 24th of February, knowing pretty well somebody was not believing in it, somebody did believe in it, but at least in general, they somehow agreed in advance that another European country was going to be militarily occupied, deprived of its institutions, sovereignty, and we as Europe in general would get along with it. I mean, this in itself, right, if we think seriously about this, if you accept such a premise, it's already a catastrophe. And that's why also I liked what Andreas was describing, this kind of German discourse in the media. As far as I can follow it, I also like have pretty much the same impression. But it's just really, we can play with this dichotomy of like empathy, solidarity, or but really, I mean, something more fundamental like has already started. And I also like what Svetlana was saying, that it's not just disinformation, it's about terror, right? I mean, and the same has to be applied to political field, in my view, that it's not just about solidarity or providing weaponry for the country in dire need, but it's about really something more fundamental in terms of warfare. So I think it's so what is strange for me is that it seems like we have already known this, we have already experienced this, and even before the 24th, we knew what it is going, right? But at the same time, it got us and caught us by surprise. And I think that this sort of schizophrenia, in a way, that this kind of disruption of time is really very much telling, and I think we cannot even imagine the extent to which this disruption that has already happened and is just on the go without any end whatsoever, right, anytime soon, the extent at which it is going to degrade the European democracy. I'm sorry for being very pathetic. The European democracy fundamentally. And that's I'm really worried about, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just taking a quick look at our questions, and there's several that have to do, or that are along the lines of what more can Canada, can Western countries do? So I don't know if some of you want to think about in the area of media, for example, is there more that Canada can do? I mean, I could just mention we've tried to sanction, right, so-called kind of disinformation agents. There have been different moves to, I don't know, ban Russian TV to expose false narratives and so on and so forth. Are there any of these kind of ideas that have been circulating that you think should be adopted, or, you know, that the West should be, or certain countries should be, you know, concentrating more of their time in thinking about how to use them? Okay, so what more can Canada do, can the Western countries do to help Ukraine, in particular in the area of media?
Maybe I can open up with just echoing some of Andreas's comments about how like empathy is one of the biggest narratives in the media, and how, you know, there's a lot of coverage about bravery of everyday citizens and the heroism of Ukrainian people, and how, you know, they've got this is kind of the sentiment. But I do think, like, I'm hard pressed to find another issue that 91% of Canadians agree upon, that is that they oppose the war. So there, I think, also speaking to your question, Nicole, is that it's pretty clear that people oppose Putin's war, and the media coverage, I think, is reflecting this quite a lot. But then the question translates from the narrative and how it's being funneled into political action, which I think is also the question that was just posed. So I would say that one thing I would say is opposing this narrative of we can support Ukraine through this oil and gas initiative, right? Again, that will take several years to complete. So I'm not exactly, I wish I had real answers, but I would say one of them would be demystifying this Canadian nationalist pro-oil narrative into some real action that is like in solidarity with Ukraine, whether it be financial or otherwise military.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to try to answer that question for the responses? Okay, I'm going to read some of the questions that are coming in that are directed to particular speakers. So, for example, for Andreas, we have Claire Cullen is writing, if Western Europe gets more active, gets more active in the war in order to secure oil and gas supply for their population as winter sets in, will this be viewed strictly as self-interest and therefore not build confidence that the West will really support nations under threat? Once the winter is over, would the West pull back? So I was trying to speculate what's going to happen. I think of China threatening Taiwan. Will the West support Taiwan unless there's a benefit for the West to do so? Would you like to try to answer this?
I'm not sure I got that correctly, but in a way, the argument would be in Germany that we should not support as much as we do Ukraine, and we should lower sanctions against Russia, because then perhaps we will get energy again from Russia, for instance, through the still existing Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and that will then help us to get through the winter. Yeah, so that would be a typical argument that you will hear a lot. You know, cannot afford trade war we're waging against Russia. Basically, you know, it creates too many problems. We are destroying our industry. We are destroying jobs and our future. We are creating inflation. The poor people in Germany have to, they're paying the bill, and there's a lot of that in German discourse. And then, this is then that becomes then sort of balanced. Yes, we are of course supportive of the Ukrainians rather than the Russians, but at the end of the day, it's what happens in Ukraine stays in Ukraine, and it's while we have empathy with the Ukraine, we have also our own interests. That would be a typical line that often is actually voiced in Germany, maybe in Canada too, or in other countries too. And and then then you get actually into this sort of what is more important, your empathy, or and some would say we should have empathy for our own people first of all. They shouldn't be freezing, and that's how I think we need this argument about it's in our interests, not only in the Ukrainians' interests, and it's in our national interest that Ukraine wins this war and Russia loses this war, and not just halfway. Not just that Ukraine can sort of survive as a country, but lose perhaps a few territories and get beaten by Russia. But that is what people would usually say. No, of course we want Ukraine to exist and so on, but can't they just give away these territories Russia has just captured, and then we can start trading with Russia again, and we won't have inflation and high energy prices and so on. That's why I think we need this. We needed a refocusing of this. We need to tell the full costs for ourselves, and then maybe we'll get into, that we actually will deliver tanks, and that we will apply, for instance, secondary sanctions, which means sanctions not only against Russian companies but also against non-Russian companies that trade with Russia. So, that is, I think, a big instrument that still the West has. what Russia is now doing, well, okay, the West is not trading with us anymore, so we go to Asian countries, and they will trade with us. So we don't need the West actually. So, but we could sanction then the Asian companies that trade with Russia. But we don't do that because, you know, it's going to be too costly for us. And, you know, while we support the Ukrainians, we're not going to invest here too much of our sort of we have. And that is kind of a misunderstanding of our interests, you know. That's how we have to get over that.
Another question is coming here for so actually it's from Svetlana. Can you tell about the reaction of the Russian diaspora in Germany, their disinformation propaganda efforts to aid Russia, how they use German media? So can we say something about the Russian diaspora in Germany? Maybe Andreas wants to add to that too.
Yeah, I think I make it very short. It's very difficult to say something clear cut about the Russian diaspora because it's a wide spectrum of people. You have very Ukrainian Russians in Germany that are organized even. You have neutral Russians and you have pro-Putinist Russians. So it's not a clear-cut picture. And also the electoral behavior of this diaspora is not so, you know, it's and in any way it's not a big factor in Germany, even if you assume that, you know, these people would be sort of supportive of Russian foreign policies and of Putin. It's not going to play, as I said, these narratives are that important anymore. It's more this sort of the general worldview, if you like, pacifism, and, you know, how does international politics work? What is European security order? Why is it important for us? You know, what's it at stake? People don't understand that, and then they think, you know, it's not so important. It's a bit like with the air that we breathe, you know, it's not a problem as long as it's there. Only when it's gone, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and when I hear the way how, Andreas, I understand you're using the word narratives is that particular explanations, right? So making sense of certain absurdity. And that's what I think is very interesting, right? So I like this particular use of the word narratives here, because myself, I'm quite interested in, again, this general intention everywhere to make sense of what does not make sense or does not make sense in a way we used to experience something meaningful. And that is kind of has to do with a lot of perceptions, right, of what is happening, because we at the same time are completely overwhelmed by the information, given so much of, again, videos, publications, witness accounts and whatnot, right? All sort of channels, media, etc., right? So, and then you are trying to kind of bring it all together, but it doesn't. But this intention, almost like that's why kind of so many like conspiracy theories and etc. Conspiracy theories, it's one of such narratives in the end, because it's an attempt to connect all dots, to produce perfect sense of what is, again, as we see, almost kind of like psychotic, chaotic, illogical kind of and random kind of unpacking situation, right? So yeah, and that's just my little comment on that. But I must say I know less about the diaspora, and I will let Vasil probably talk also more about this. Just with one little thing I want to add about the activity and activism of Russian citizens being, again, in Germany or elsewhere. What surprises me in terms of perception and action, so I don't even care what perception is. I care about the lack of action. And I already, like this, may understand why people were not mobilized in Russia. And indeed, if all those people who escaped the war, all those thousands and thousands of people who left Russia now, if they would have come out, imagine that kind of protest. But no, they escaped the country instead. And when they escaped the country to all the other safe territories and countries, they don't protest there either. They're still silent. And that was, I think, shows not that they also suffer, but to what extent the ability to political action is actually suppressed and erased in the population overall.
Okay, well, at this stage, it is now exactly 2 o'clock. I'd like to thank again our panelists for this, difficult but very, very important discussion. I'd like to thank especially those of you who are joining from Europe, and obviously Svetlana in Ukraine, and thank you for making the effort, for joining us late at night. Please, everybody, stay safe. Thank you to the event partners who brought this together, the Digital Democracies Institute, the SFU Schools for Communications, SFU Public Square, and SFU School for International Studies. Okay, take care. And we hope to continue the conversation again another time.